Buongiorno. It's okay to speak back, even if it's a lecture, isn't it? In Italy, we would greet each other in the morning. And Italy is the primary country where I've been working the last 5 years. We would say good morning to each other by saying, Buongiorno. Can you say it? That's good. I know you're maybe getting ready to take notes, but you've got to use your hands if you're going to say buongiorno, you know. In Italy, we talk with our hands, and so I'm very grateful that I don't have to hold the microphone like this. Shall we try it one more time on the count of 3? 1, 2, 3. Buongiorno. Much better, much better. It is really an honor for me to be with you. My husband and I and our sons moved back to the U.S. last summer, 2012. Well, we now live in that far, far country known as New York State. We live in the snow belt, in Syracuse, where we get more snow every year than any other U.S. city that has more than 100,000 residents. And so I greet you from that far, far country known as New York State. You know, I grew up feeling a sense of call to missions, and I always sensed that I would serve overseas, and you know, that would be a really far country. But I can assure you that there are places you can go here in the U.S. That will give you a cross-cultural mission experience if you feel God is calling you to that sort of a thing. It might not be all the way to New York State. It might just be to the inner city of Knoxville, or it might be to a poverty-stricken home here or in Talbot. You don't always have to go far away to have a cross-cultural ministry, but I've been blessed that God has allowed me to minister for the last 11 years in Italy and in Belgium doing cross-cultural ministry. Thomas, Dr. Bass, 30 years ago he wasn't Dr. Bass, but I'm glad to get to call him that now. Thomas didn't mention to you, he's too humble to tell you that he saved my neck. I was a pretty good student. I thought I was really good because I was the, I call it head nincompoop of Worth County, very rural county, but I was like had the highest SAT score. Coming from my county, I was big, serious business. But at Mercer, I met really serious students, intelligent people like Thomas. I was taking history pass-fail. Only had to take one history course, thank goodness. But I was taking it pass-fail. It was right after chapel, I think at 11 o'clock every day. And I had the hardest time. I could stay awake in chapel just fine, because I was interested and that was relevant. What was going on in chapel really resonated with me. But then I would get to history at 11 o'clock and I would fall asleep every day. But Thomas was in that same class and he could stay awake and take notes. And so Thomas was gracious enough to tutor me before all of the exams. And I actually passed that history course by 2 points. And so was able to proceed to get one of those cum laude degrees or whatever you call that. So thank you, Thomas, for tutoring me and using your notes to help me get through. As I've thought about what God has called me to, where God wanted me to invest my life, there's been a verse or chapter of Scripture that's been very important to me, and it's probably very familiar to you. It comes from the book of Micah, chapter 6, verses 6 through 8. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before God with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Then later in that passage it finishes, God has told you, O mortal, O man, O woman, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with God? We spent a lot of time when we were in college, and I think it's the same way with you all, wrestling with what is God calling us to? What has God given us gifts to accomplish in our lives? How can we use responsibly the education, the opportunities that God has given to us? But I've found this a good guiding rule. God has called us to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with our God. Now, I started out on my path after college and then after seminary in social work. But I continued to have a sense of God calling me to missions. And so eventually my husband and I were able to move to Belgium and to start working in a Dutch-speaking house plant. But even after I had that sense of, okay, I'm where God wants me to be, I'm a missionary now, God continued to call. The voice of God came to me through a colleague who had worked in Thailand, helping women and girls have alternate job opportunities out of the sex industry there in Thailand. That colleague came through town and she said, Debbie, I'm looking for people who are doing ministry to women in prostitution in this area. Do you know anybody? She had actually brought a Hungarian film crew and they were going to make a movie to be shown here in the U.S. And I did some research, but nobody was ministering to the women in prostitution in Ghent, the city closest to me. I said, Lauren, you come and stay with us, though, as you're coming through. Well, Lauren stayed with us, and she said, Debbie, we're going on to Antwerpen, another Flemish city in northern Belgium, and then we're going to Amsterdam, and we're going to meet women in the red light district. Would you like to come with us? And I said, no, Lauren, I've got to get the kids to school. Jim's got something he's got to go do with another church tomorrow. In the back of my head, I'm thinking, Lauren Bethel, you are crazy if you think this Baptist pastor is going into the red light district. I mean, my mama and daddy raised me right. They raised me in the pews of the Baptist church. And they taught me there are places where good girls go and places where good girls don't go. And I am certainly not going to be seen in the red light district of any city. Maybe some of you all had that same type of education, God calls us to be righteous. Yeah, God calls us to justice and loving kindness and walking humbly. But God sure doesn't call us to get close to anybody who's living what we would consider to be in sin. Well, I thought about it more that night, and my husband said to me, Debbie, if you would like to go with Lauren, I can change my plans. I can be here to get the kids. You would have an opportunity to get to know Lauren better. And so Lauren had just won a Baptist World Alliance big award that Jimmy Carter had won the year before. You guys are younger, but perhaps you've heard the name Jimmy Carter. I know. Lauren is sort of the Mother Teresa for us in my Baptist denomination. And so I said, okay, Jim, I'll go to get to know Lauren, this saint, this woman I looked up to. Well, I found myself on that trip with Lauren holding hands with a Nigerian woman named Blessing who was being prostituted in the red light district of Antwerp. Blessing was so glad for Lauren and myself and a volunteer of a ministry to come to her window, to come where she was waiting for clients, to be nice to her, to greet her. We offered her information about other Nigerian women who had been trafficked into the sex industry in Amsterdam and how they had been able to make choices to get out of the sex industry, how God had been faithful to them. When we asked Blessing, would you like us to pray for you before we go? She said, yes. And so Blessing drew this white curtain, this sheer curtain over her door, which was a glass door window. She drew that curtain, and the four of us stood and held hands there in the glow of the pink light that was there on the bar in the same room. Now, as we bowed our head, I thought, if my mama knew where I was right now, at this point, I'm 38. I'm still thinking what my mama is thinking. You might not ever get over that, and maybe that's a good thing. But I thought, if my mama knew where I was right now, what would she think? But the presence of God was with us, even in that place where there was darkness, there was exploitation. But God used that experience to teach me that Blessing was a human being. Now I want to teach you something about you came to learn about human trafficking this morning, right? Or to get the credit, let's face it. Maybe you just came to get the credit because you had to be here. But I want to teach you the most important thing I found when we talk about the issue of human trafficking and prostitution. Look at the people sitting next to you. Take a good look. Go ahead, take a look at the people sitting next to you. Yeah, it's crazy, but she's saying it. Dr. Bass has already told you she's a reverend, and so you got to expect some odd things, okay? You look at those people. Now, what I want you to remember about people who are victims of human trafficking, and women or men or boys or girls who are exploited in the sex industry, is they are human beings just like those people sitting next to you. Yes, they may be victims. Yes, they may be exploited in the most inhumane ways you can imagine. But the people who are victims of human trafficking are the women, the children, the boys, the men who are exploited in the sex industry are human beings. Human trafficking has been in the news a lot. There's a lot of money. Right now, a lot of agencies are really good in raising a lot of money to get the word out about human trafficking. You can do a Google search and read for hours about what human trafficking is, so I'm not going to spend time on the definition. It's important to remember that officially, when we talk about human trafficking, a lot of times the wording would be trafficking in persons. And if you want to read about international human trafficking, you might look at the TIP reports, the trafficking in person reports. The United States, I believe it's the State Department, every year issues a report on how a country, all the countries around the world, each individual country is doing in terms of preventing trafficking, of helping trafficking victims from their country, and of prosecuting the traffickers themselves. So that's an important resource that's online. But also when we talk about human trafficking, realistically we're talking about modern slavery. Modern slaves today sell for less than African slaves sold for when we had slavery here in the U.S., when Africans were held in bondage here. You can buy an Eastern European woman for $500 to $750. Can you imagine that? I mean, slavery is always brutal. Slavery was brutal when we had it here in the U.S. in terms of what happened here in the South. But the reality is, of all the years of fighting slavery in the world, we have not overcome the problem. And rather than having fewer people who are treated as slaves, who live as slaves, we have more people, and the demand for slavery is so high, and there are so many women, children, men, boys who are vulnerable to being enslaved that the cost of a slave now is less than it was in the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s. When we talk about human trafficking in the U.S., we tend to automatically think sex trafficking. I just want to remind you that human trafficking takes a variety of forms. There are many, many different kinds of forced labor in which people would be exploited. You might have women who are exploited as domestic workers. You might have people who are doing heavy physical labor, harvesting crops. If you read the material from Kevin Bales, here in the U.S., we have a huge problem with slavery in our agricultural system. People who come in without documents, or their documents are held, and then they're forced to live in deplorable circumstances. They have there's no sense of the person they're working for following the labor laws, working incredible hours in unsanitary conditions. In the end, we too often profit from that, right? Because the fast food chain that's slinging that tomato on our hamburger or chopping that up and putting it on our taco likes to buy those cheap tomatoes. So we have to be careful as consumers, anytime we're consuming it, thinking about asking the questions, where did this come from? Why can I get it so cheaply? It's a lot of work, it takes a lot of effort, but we want to be sure that we're not exploiting someone way back who actually helped to produce that product. So not all human trafficking is sex trafficking. It takes a lot of forms. And not all prostitution is human trafficking. What I would say, as a woman who's worked with a lot of victims of human trafficking or women who are exploited in the sex industry, 99% of people who end up being used in prostitution in particular didn't feel like they had another choice. They didn't have maybe the educational opportunities that you and I did, or maybe they got an education but there weren't job opportunities in their local community, and so they wanted to go maybe to Western Europe or come to the US to work. And so there's a debate with people who work in the human trafficking for sexual exploitation area about, is prostitution ever really a choice? Personally, having met some women in prostitution who tell me, yeah, this is a choice for me, I'm not proud of it, but I don't have a pimp behind me, I try to respect them. And if they are telling me they're not forced to be there, I'm not going to say they are forced. I'm not going to question their motives. I might ask them about their story of what brought them to that. Who are the women in prostitution in Europe? I worked in Western Europe, in Italy and Belgium, as I already said, but I've also had a lot of contacts with people who are working in this area in Spain and France, in Austria and Germany. I could give you a lot of statistics about the women in prostitution in Europe, but you can find all those online in statistics. Sorry, Thomas and you other science people, but I find them a little uninteresting. So I want to tell you about who some of the women in prostitution in Europe are from a personal point of view. One of the women in prostitution in Europe used to be Emma. Now, when I went to Europe to work, particularly went to Italy, and Italian Baptists asked me to work with women in prostitution, I thought I'd have to go to the street to meet the women in prostitution. I pictured myself as a hero that's going to go in, I'm going to meet the women, I'm going to establish a big fancy project to give them a place to live and jobs and all of that. But what I found was, as I started to visit some churches in Italy, there were women in prostitution in those churches. Fortunately, the churches that we were partnering with were not a part of the human trafficking system. Pastor Victor let me know that the first Sunday I visited his church. I'm guessing most, if not all of you, go to church fairly regularly. At least you come in here, and you might not expect to meet a woman in prostitution in here. Pastor Victor, the first Sunday we went to his church, he called my husband and I up to the front pew on that side after the service, started telling us about his church. One of the first things he told us was, women who work in prostitution are not allowed to put money in the offering plate. Now, have any of you ever heard a pastor say that in a church? Yeah, it's not something we usually mention. But what Victor was telling us was his church did not profit from the sex industry. And see, you have to be wise when you start to go out, no matter where you are. He was telling us there are churches you'll find here in Italy, usually they're immigrant churches, but where the pastor is a part of the trafficking ring, where the pastor will have madams or pimps bring their women to that church, and then that pastor will preach, you got to tithe, because it says it in the Bible, right? And the pastor will preach, you've got to keep your promises. In the Nigerian context, a Nigerian woman, before she is trafficked from Nigeria, quite often she will sign a legal contract to pay her trafficker a certain amount of money. Usually it's $60,000 to $70,000 these days. And so that pastor will manipulate that woman who's being exploited in prostitution, will manipulate her faith and say, you made a promise to pay the madam the money, you've got to go out and do that. And so even a church can be used as a tool for the manipulation of women who are being exploited. Even faith can be used as a tool. Well, Victor said, we don't take advantage of the women who are working in prostitution, but they are welcome in our church, because if anybody needs a church, if anybody needs a safe place, it's a woman who's working in prostitution. In Victor's church, we met 5 young women who were working the street 6 days a week, and on Sunday, they would come to church. They had been working in prostitution long enough that they had paid their debt. You know, a lot of human traffickers will hold power over the women because the women have agreed to pay a certain debt. So the women had paid off their debt, but they continued to work in prostitution because they didn't have a document. They couldn't go out and get a normal job. Their trafficker had not made it a priority for them to learn to speak Italian. You know, that would have cost the trafficker money. So the woman couldn't go and work in Italy, where she would have to be able to speak Italian in a normal job. And then, of course, there's a psychological change that's gone on in a woman. In Italy, to pay off a debt, the typical Nigerian woman would need to work for 3 or 4 years. Because it's unprofitable for a pimp or a madam if a woman is pregnant and working the street, the pimps or madams will force the women to have abortions. And so a typical Nigerian girl has had 3 or 4 abortions by the time she's paid off her debt. And a Nigerian girl, most of whom have grown up in an evangelical Christian context in southern Nigeria, not only does she have the shame of feeling like her body has been used, she's allowed, although she's been forced into prostitution, she comes to believe she's allowed herself to be used in prostitution. And that's all a part, too, of the technique of the trafficker or the pimp to convince them that they're dirty, they're used up. Even once a woman breaks free of her pimp, then she's very likely to stay in prostitution because she thinks she's dirty. They think, if I've allowed this to happen to me, how could God ever love me anymore? If I've allowed this to happen to me, how could I ever have a normal relationship with a man? How could I ever get married and have a family? And so in this church, in Victor's church, we had 5 young women who had broken free of their traffickers by paying their debt, most of them, but they were still working in prostitution. And so I met Emma in that church. Jim and I explained to these 5 young women that Italy has a great program to help women who are victims of human trafficking. It's actually a much more advanced system than we have here in the U.S., from what I know of the system here. In Italy, if a woman has been forced into, or has been a victim of human trafficking, it doesn't have to be just sexual trafficking, but it usually is. If she's been forced into the sex industry, and if she's willing to identify her pimp and cooperate with authorities, she can have a residency document, which means she can be in Italy legally. She doesn't get deported back to her home country. Deportation is the normal model that countries use. But she can live in Italy legally. She can have a safe place to live. Let's face it, one of the manipulative tools of the traffickers is they threaten the women. If you try to run away from me, I'm going to hurt you. It's quite frequent, particularly that African women who are exploited by pimps in Western Europe will go missing. They're undocumented, there's no way to trace them, and they just disappear. Sometimes they're found in a field a little while later, but that's usually only if another of the women in prostitution is able to communicate with authorities that the woman has gone missing, or if a client who maybe is a regular goes to the police and says, look, this friend of mine is missing. And so it's very important in our human trafficking victim help program in Italy and anywhere around the world that you can provide a safe place for the woman to be. The woman can have job training, counseling, medical services, everything it takes to start a new life. We would explain this to Emma and to the other women in that Nigerian church. But Emma would say, you know, I can't turn in my trafficker. In fact, she said to me one time, it would be evil for me to turn in my trafficker. That trafficker had threatened Emma's family, and that trafficker knew where Emma's family lived because his wife had recruited her from her little village. Emma's mother was single. She had 2 children younger than Emma, and Emma had an older brother. The family had just a little piece of property where they grew those long sweet potatoes. They're not orange like ours. They're white inside. But it was very hard to make a living that way, and so Emma finished middle school, but her mother couldn't afford the fees for her to continue on into high school, couldn't pay for uniforms and books and the things you've got to have even in public school or pay for in public school in Nigeria. So Emma finished middle school, and she got a job in a shop in a village close by. And the woman who was running the shop, after a while, said, Emma, you're a hard worker, you know, you learn quickly. My husband has a store in Holland, in the northern part of the Netherlands, an African store, and I can work it out if you want to. You could go work for him in the Netherlands. And Emma, like any other young Nigerian girl, had an image in her head of what Western Europe would be like. You know, things were easier there. There was money. You could make money to take care of yourself. You could make money to send back to your family in Africa. And so Emma took the job opportunity, but in her ignorance, she was taken by a friend of her trafficker to the capital city. She was kept in the capital city for about 3 weeks in a hotel while all of the fake documents were prepared for her. They handed her the fake documents and a group of airplane tickets. Now, I don't know, you guys have probably flown before, but it was Emma's first time, and she didn't know, you know, to look through the tickets and realize she had multiple flights she was going to have to take. Well, when she got to the last ticket, after several flights, she found herself in Milan, Italy, not in the Netherlands. The trafficker had arranged for her to have a cell phone, and he had given her a number to call when she would arrive in the Netherlands, so she called that number in Italy, and the man picked up on the other end. It was a voice she recognized. He said, take the train to Verona, and I'll pick you up there. So she managed to do that, and he picked her up. He took her to his apartment, and he said, Emma, you know, you're in the country illegally. Those are false documents you had. If you go to the police, they're going to send you back to Nigeria. And you owe me $60,000 for having brought you here. And the only way for you to make that money is to go out and do the road work. The Nigerians call street prostitution road work. And Emma said, but I'm a Christian. That wouldn't be right. That would be sinful for me to go out and do that. And he said, well, if you don't do that, I'm going to hurt you. I'm going to beat you up. And I know where your family is, and so if you don't go out and do that, I can go get your little sister. I can bring her up here and make her do the road work. I can go to your mother and tell her that you're up here in Italy working in prostitution. And so Emma started working the street. She continued to work until eventually she got arrested for not having documents. One of the important things about the way my mission does ministry is we're not Lone Ranger missionaries. We work in cooperation with the Baptists of the local country. And so I had an identity card that I'm an Italian Baptist pastor that lets me get into the jail or into the prison. And so I went to see Emma in the jail, and she wasn't dressed in those tight-fitting clothes like she had worn to the street, but also wore to church because that's all she had. That day she was wearing a black jogging suit that was oversized, and she had black flip-flops. And I had gone through 2 locked gates the guards had locked me into a room, and they brought Emma in and locked us in together. And I got up and I hugged her and I said, Emma, I'm so sorry you've been arrested. We figured she would be deported back to Nigeria. And Emma said, it's okay, it's okay. I said, what do you mean, Emma, it's okay? She was smiling by this point. She said, I think God's using this to get me out of prostitution. I'm not going to go back. I'm not going to go back whatever it takes. Fortunately, the system didn't work well in Italy. Nigeria was not willing to take Emma back, not willing to cooperate with the Italian government for the transfer or with the IOM, International Office of Migration, that handles most of the paperwork. And Emma was just released back out onto the sidewalk. But we as a church, together with Pastor Victor, were able to work it out for a couple to take her in, to give her a room that was safe, a room she didn't have to pay for, until she could go and find another job. Emma eventually was able to go work for a young couple, or I'm sorry, not a young couple, a middle-aged couple who had a grandmother living with them. It was because of funds that people here in the U.S. had collected and sent to us as missionaries that we were able to give that couple the funds it took to pay for the process to get Emma a document and to give her a little money to work with. Emma's just one of the women who used to be in prostitution in Europe. Others would be Blessing, another Nigerian, Goodness. Goodness' father sold her when she was 13. He was not in her life in Nigeria anymore, but he came back to the family, told Goodness that he had a brother who was going to take her to Italy where she could go to school, go to university, and then work. And it turned out, though, instead Goodness was actually sold to someone who prostituted her on the streets of Naples. Women in prostitution in Italy are Katya. Katya is from Moldova, a country from the former Soviet Union. She's very intelligent, very bright, beautiful. You'll see her standing on the roadside in the heat of summer, in the cold of winter. You might think of her as a woman of low morals. You know, that's the way I would have thought of her back when Dr. Bass and I were in school. But if you start to talk to Katya, you'll find out that she's a member of the church back in Moldova. You'll find out that she was the top of her class in high school. But she didn't have money to go on to college or to a training school. And so she comes to Italy and works for 3 months, makes money, and then she goes back to Moldova and takes another semester of courses. She comes back to Italy and works and goes back to Moldova and takes courses. There's no one model of who the women in prostitution in Western Europe are. And the same thing is true if we talked about the sex industry here in the U.S. There's no typical model, no typical description of who a woman is, who is a victim of sex trafficking, except that all of them are human beings like the people sitting in the pews next to you. Another issue is, who are the clients? This is the question that I wanted to ask when it was in the news here in the U.S. maybe a month or two ago. How many of you saw that the FBI had broken up several human trafficking rings here in the U.S.? Some of you see that? Anybody see that? You can raise your hand. Yeah? Okay. You know, we heard about in how many, I've forgotten the numbers now, but in how many cities they had broken up trafficking rings, how many traffickers were arrested, how many women were freed. What did we not hear a word about? Who are the clients? What happens with the clients? In the European Baptist Federation, we've been trying to fight human trafficking for a long time. It's been in the press in Europe a lot longer than here in the U.S. And so it's become obvious to us that we have to have a three-pronged approach. First of all, we have to do prevention. We as Baptists in Western Europe try to be encouraging to Baptists in Eastern Europe and in Africa. Those are natural partnerships, right? We don't have to go to Eastern Europe and just try to meet people on the street. Are you interested in working in trafficking? We build on the relationship we already have. Hey, we're part of the Baptist Union. Let's get together and talk about the situation of human trafficking. Let's talk about what happens to young Eastern European women who we meet in our country who are being exploited. How can we work together to keep them from ending up in the West in exploitation? We try to minimize girls' vulnerability. That means doing education in the schools, education in the universities of countries of origin. It also means trying to provide job opportunities. You might be saying, I don't know what human trafficking work has to do with me. I'm really interested in business. I've been gifted to do business, and just whatever I touch seems to flourish. One way of fighting human trafficking is to do business as mission. Start a business where you employ young girls or women who would be vulnerable to being trafficked or human trafficking victims. Another way is to look at society's models. Particularly in some Asian countries, young girls are vulnerable to being victims of human trafficking because they are supposed to grow up and take care of the family. In other models, girls are seen as worthless. For instance, my Nigerian friends who are women, unless they've gotten married and had a baby, they're pretty much nothing. At least in the areas of Nigeria, the people that I know are from. And so you have to minimize girls' and women's vulnerability, but there's no one-size-fits-all way to do that. You have to get in and meet the people and develop a plan. Another part of prevention is realizing that the sex industry is just a big money-making enterprise. If human traffickers could make more money selling tomatoes on the side of the road than selling women, they'd be out there with the tomatoes. So we as a European Baptist Federation are trying to pull back and look at the demand side. How do we change the idea that it's okay for men to buy sex? Now here in the U.S. we say, well, it's not okay, right? We have a law, and it's not legal for a man to use services of a prostitute, except in 5 counties in Nevada. So we think, okay, we've got the law, so everything is okay. But what has that done here in the U.S.? The sex industry is underground, isn't it? I can assure you, I don't encourage you to do it, particularly if you're a man, but if you went on and Googled any town of any size in the U.S., you would find a way to find women in prostitution here in the U.S. Working with legislation is one way to deal with the issue of human trafficking. For instance, in Sweden, prostitution was legal. You could buy services from a woman in prostitution, and you could sell services. But the Swedish government says because we see men and women as equal before God, which is a biblical approach from what we would consider maybe a secular government. But if men and women are equal before God, then it's never okay for a man to buy sex from a woman. And they said, however, we're going to see the women who are working in the sex industry not as criminals, but as victims. We are not going to put any of our investment in arresting women, prosecuting women. We're going to go after the men who are the clients. And so what's happened in Sweden, the presence of prostitution has decreased, all research shows, by 50%. And the sociological studies have been done in the other Scandinavian countries that was not just by accident. That wasn't a function of the economic situation. Prostitution has increased in the other Scandinavian countries since the Swedish have put their model in place. So prevention of human trafficking can be minimizing girls' vulnerability. It can be decreasing the demand that drives the sex industry. Another big piece of that is to open up conversations about sexuality. My dear mother who did the best she could, you know what she taught me about sexuality? You don't know how men are. I hope things have gotten a little better. Certainly in our household, we try to talk openly about what it means to be male, female, created in God's image, that it's never okay to exploit someone else's sexuality because it's the image of God in them. But perhaps this is something your generation will do better than my mother's generation or our generation. Open up discussions, build models to talk about being male and female, even in our churches, that aren't based on shame. Shame is not a good motivator. We've tried that. Our law against prostitution in the U.S. is a shame-based model. We have to find a better way. So we work on prevention, we work on intervention. We do street outreach to women in prostitution, we do window prostitution outreach, we provide medical accompaniment for a girl who's working in prostitution. If she's been working for a decent amount of time and her pimp knows he can trust her to go to work and come back, chances are he'll also trust her to go with a social worker to see the doctor. That's an opportunity to establish a relationship and to talk about opportunities for getting off the street. Intervention also involves social services and alternate employment opportunities. Then we also try to work with aftercare and empowerment. In Italy, the government funds individual women's projects. If they are able to escape their trafficker and they cooperate with authorities, they can have, as I mentioned, safe housing. This is a big issue in the U.S. Those women who were freed from their traffickers by the FBI a couple of months ago, I think there were over 100 of them, if I remember correctly. The reality is there's not 100 beds in the U.S. that are specifically designated to help a victim of human trafficking, a woman who's been sexually or exploited in the sex industry. They get put in domestic violence shelters, in centers for teens with psychiatric problems, and so we need to address here providing appropriate services for them. Okay, if your professor gives you an assignment that you got to write more and you need more information, I'll save you a Google step if you want to go to www.polarisproject.org. They have a wonderful listing of resources about human trafficking here in the U.S. and around the world. And you can always, if you suspect an instance of human trafficking, you can call the hotline, 888-3737-888. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. There are a lot of ways to fight trafficking. You don't all have to go out to the street and minister to women in prostitution. You might be a business person that can employ people who are at risk. But one thing we all can do is everyone we meet, our roommate, somebody down the hall, we can remember that they are a human being and we can treat them with respect and with love, and in that way we treat them with justice. Thanks for listening.